as opposed to a quantity per hour. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when looking at the parts here, you won't see, this will not affect this number here of finishing labor. It is in itself a little separate labor, and you can also create you can take drill holes and clone it, create any sort of finishing labor that you might have, and simply adjust the times for that particular item. So those are kind of useful and pretty flexible in what you can do with them. And I think it's a pretty cool addition to finishing that Rob did.
Yeah, I've noticed we've had to do a lot of playing around with easel backs, with rewriting the layout when people aren't using any easels on that one pull down there. People are using that as a catch-all for
a
lot of different things. Yeah.
Yes. There is an alternative to that. I've seen that myself, and I almost wish that this was miscellaneous. It may make more sense in a way that you can. Well, this would need to be miscellaneous and have a variable quantity tab, but because I do believe if we select easel back, actually that price didn't change that much. It is 10 each, so that's what I would have expected. However,
yeah, and actually the quantity each would be helpful too, because sometimes if you're making do with what you've got in the shop, sometimes you have to use two smaller ones instead of one larger one.
That's true. That's true. I've seen that myself. That's really not a bad suggestion there. I've seen that myself. Now, I've dealt with it other ways because exactly like you say, some customers will. You'll see that other things are linked into this drop down. But really the better way to do it is to put it here in drill holes. And I was actually going to bring that up, so let me go ahead and show you that. In selection list, under finishing, miscellaneous finishing labor is pulling here the parts that are in miscellaneous finishing labor. So we have the drill hole and the rounded corners, and it's using the parent default consumption on the variable. The parent default is MISC underscore finishing quantity 1, I believe, or finishing miss quantity 1 and finishing miss quantity 2. And so knowing that, and you can verify it on the variable itself, but knowing that, I normally get people who have that need of adding additional per unit items that aren't labors. Go ahead and add them to this selection list. So you could do, for example, either inserting the parts or inserting a part category. All right, I can do that and say under consumption do that, which is the quantity variable on that pricing form. All right, if we do this, then the customer can go and use the pricing form. And I wouldn't put easel backs there necessarily because you have a place here, unless they have the need for multiple quantities. And you could say easel 8-inch double wing, and we need 1 each. And actually, that formula would be 1 times quantity. So in this case, we're only seeing 1, but setting the formula at 1 times quantity would make it 10. Now, the one thing that you have to be careful with here is if you're going to do this, you have to clone the selection list, give it a separate name, and assign the second selection list to the miscellaneous finishing 2 variable. The reason is this selection list is using the consumption formula of finishing miscellaneous quantity 1, and as it appears down here, since this selection link is linked to both variables, if I pull easel backs in the second miscellaneous finishing, it's not going to calculate anything for that second easel back because it's looking, well, it's going to calculate 1 because it's looking for the value of the miscellaneous finishing variable number 1. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So really, to make that effective, you would have to clone this, call it miscellaneous labor 2, and save it. And then on the product itself, under sign finishing, under miscellaneous finishing 2, you would simply edit this and set the second selection list on the variable, and that of course can be done in OOB. And then they have 2 variables with distinct list. So if we had this scenario 1 and 4, we should see 1 and 4 easel backs here, which we're not. Why is that? Oh, it's not because after cloning that selection list, you would need to do, in reality, this 2 times and this times quantity, you may want to ask the customer how they want to handle that. It makes sense to do it times quantity because you're really saying we need X number of these per sign. So if we say 1 and 4, we should see 10 and 40. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
All right. Really, the last thing to, and please let me know before we move on, even though we're not moving on just yet. But the last thing to look at on this pricing form is, well, real briefly, add-ons. Does everyone have a fairly good understanding of how these work? And even though you may not know necessarily how these formulas are put together, the ones that are there are great examples to use. For example, if you look at the way additional finishing hours is used, this is a modifier that brings in a labor, in this case finishing labor, but it could be, the customer tells you that they want to manually manipulate any labor that may be in the system, or you may narrow it down to labors on the pricing form or any particular labor. You would do it exactly like finishing labor is done. Same thing with this. This is another labor. And then this next day rush, I think Rob, no one really uses rush the way that we have it set up, but it's really in there more of an example of how to do things. And really, so my question is everyone comfortable knowing where they need to go to locate these modifiers, how they're linked to the product, and how to look at the values in the modifiers?
I think so. I didn't use modifiers before, but Rob, I've seen Rob set a few of them up.
Yeah. Fortunately, OOB relies on modifiers much less than either, well, I don't know about customizable, but certainly much less than the old OOB. And Dagmar, I don't know, was Imagine customizable?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but we didn't use any modifiers.
All right. So looking at the product, we have the modifier tab, and the modifiers are linked to the product here. The other thing that non version 2 OOB customers literally had to rely on, I don't know, probably 10 or 12 modifiers per pricing form. And there's a number of challenges with that, including the product layout is difficult to produce. Sometimes the values in the modifiers, it's very, very hairy code to pull that stuff out. So I keep them at a minimum if at all possible. The other thing that is kept to a minimum in OOB is user constants. And I don't know about Imagine groups, but in the old OOB, user constants used to fill this entire middle column with a scroll bar because they were so important to the pricing forms and to the pricing calculation. For example, square foot pricing on certain products was all determined by user constants. It was a horrible scenario in my view. It was very, very bad. And so Rob definitely really worked this out in the best possible outcome that I can see in any scenario. In that user constants are really that they're user constants, and they're not. They don't really pertain to particular products for the most part. They just set global global defaults on a lot of important. Well, a lot in several important ways or requirements of the program. Of course, imperial to metric, and most of the stuff here in universal product options is aesthetic, but not all of it. Some of it is, you know, a bleed size that's added to the layout and certain other options here. So in OOB2, as opposed to working in the old customizable or the old OOB, modifiers and user constants can still be used, and they still can resolve problems, but their use is really kept at a minimal.
Peter, before you go off of user constants,
Yep.
One thing to point out with regard to modifiers is that you can select to hide modifiers from the estimate.
That's a good.
And the work order.
Yeah, and that is a great point. So if we and actually I think in the default, let me do this. Let me get out of. Let me cancel this. In the default OOB, we see these modifiers here: additional finishing hours, mounting labor, and next day rush. And if I select one, let's say rush, which is 7568, I'll show you. We'll go over how that's determined. You notice that it.
I believe.
What's that, Dagmar?
That was just a percentage.
It was.
Upcharge.
Yeah, it's again, it serves as an example as many types of options that a customer may want to pull in as a percentage of base price. In this case, it's rush, but really you kind of have to, you know, I don't think anybody who's worked in Sirius in the, you know, as of recent time really does things without looking at something else to get their ideas from within the program. I don't think there's many people who are in reinventing the wheel, except for what Rob kind of did with OOB2, and what really Rob continues to do in some cases. For example, this was just recently added, where yes, many times customers want you to print modifiers on estimates or invoices, or sometimes they don't. Now, the layouts were previously set up to where they never printed out modifiers, and you had to go in and manually add the code to print out the modifier. Rob has set it up in a really very cool way where the modifiers will print unless you cancel them, or unless you tell the system in user constants which Linda was just referring to, under universal product options, there is an option here to hide estimate modifiers. This hidden estimate modifiers also applies to invoices. If they print on the estimate, they're going to print on the invoice. So this really means hide from both. And you kind of
like you actually have to when you add a new one of either one, you actually need to add it to this if it's going to be hidden or not, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And the point, one of the things here that serves as a little bit of a lesson is you're going to come across this kind of thing all the time in Sirius, and in that you don't really, you're going to look at what Rob has in terms of a code, and you might then alter it to better suit a specific neighbor, I was going to say, a specific customer's needs. But it's going to be very rare, for the most part, that you're going to have to start from scratch in creating formula. And in this case, you really don't have to know what Rob is doing. You just have to see what and how he's, or what the syntax is, and we can just see it's an asterisk followed by the modifier name followed by an asterisk. And then all of that is wrapped in quotes. So if we added rush to this, and it could be, I'm not sure, but it's very, very possible that this may be case sensitive. All right, so change that, we save it.
Peter, don't you need to add an asterisk on the end of that?
Yeah, you should. Did I not do that?
No.
Yeah, it's too small, hard for me to see, so I couldn't tell.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I'm just trying to make sure I got it right.
Yeah. Asterisk behind it is right. All right, and so adding that, the reason we're not seeing the additional labor or the additional mounting modifier is because Rob had already added that to the user constants. And if we edit this now, you'll see that the modifier went away. And whatever we all know that whatever we see underneath the line item is what the customer is going to see, unless they select print description only here.
And then what happens if it's product based, where they say, well, I'm going to use it in this product but not in that one, and you've turned it all off?
It's universal.
It is universal. So
yep.
if they want it on an individual one, then you would just have to remove it from the user constant.
Well, again, it's going to be what the customer needs. Suppose that he wants it hidden I don't know that this has come up, but is no telling, it could come up, that the customer wants it hidden from some products and not the others. Then you would have to have a cloned modifier that does exactly the same thing with a different name.
Got it. Okay. Got it.
So that you could have that ability. Be the only way.
Okay.
So, as part of learning this stuff, make it a habit to go and study the formulas that are there, and just literally, I literally would take the line of code, scratch it out, and input the number that line of code called for, just to understand what the equation structure was. And then that truthfully, and you certainly don't have to be a math whiz in any way, but that truthfully makes things a whole lot easier to understand than just seeing the code syntax. In the case of something like a next day rush, it doesn't hurt anything to understand. Sorry, let me pull that back up. It doesn't hurt anything to understand exactly what's happening when a customer selects that option. So, you don't have to systematically do it, but as you're poking around, try to touch every part of the pricing form. And looking at the rush modifier, the product link is here, so every product that's in this, every product that is listed here carries this modifier or add-on, and every product has the potential to have a separate
value.
default value, and that value can be yes, no, or formula based. And the pricing tab will either show you a formula, in this case the base price times 15%, or it's going to, in the case of parts, I'll show you three real common ones. Is a formula, something like this. Rush, many people have different definitions of rush, like next day or overnight or 2-day or something like that. So even though a lot of your customers will use rush, many of them will need it set up a little bit different. But certainly you can use this as the base idea. You just may have multiple tiers to it, or you're going to have a modifier where parts are brought in which case, like additional finishing labor, when additional finishing labor is brought in, it's actually bringing in the part. This is an error. It should not be, and I've cleared this up a couple of times. It seems to keep happening. This modifier should only have one labor on it. You see that the finishing labor part is being brought in. It is technically, this should be, to be more consistent, this modifier, this part should be brought in when the expression quantity applied is true, and consume how much is quantity applied by the hour. So if we look at the pricing form, at any time, quantity applied means the value in the value field. So if we say 0.25 of quantity applied, that's going to be 15 minutes. So it's bringing the quarter an hour worth of labor in. Okay, 0.25. But looks like that. Linda, this is something that we may need to look at in the OOB, because it looks like mounting labor too. Both of these have an additional labor on them.
Okay. I'll take a look at it. So they each should just have the one.
Yeah. What happens? It looks like which is something that you need to be aware of in cloning labor parts. Make sure to remove any product links or modifier links, or else it's going to reattach itself to the products and modifiers. So quantity applied is a variable that is reserved for modifiers, and it relates to the field value on any modifier. Okay. Now, before moving on from this product into cut vinyl, I want to touch on selection list in their basic use, because even though it's varied what you can do with selection list, the basic use is uniform throughout most of the system. And the first thing is going to be dependent selection list using dynamic links. And so the best way that I can alert you to be aware that a dependent selection list is being used is if what shows up, Rob has done a fairly good job of blocking off linked sections of the program, of the pricing form. There is a practical reason for that. And so if you encounter a situation where what you select in the top part of the selection list determines what shows up in the bottom, that's always a dependent selection list. Now, how do we know what selection list we're linking to here? In some cases it's fairly easy because you can go add edit selection list in view. In some cases it won't be so easy, and you need to know how to locate the list, such as this. Now we can cheat and go to the top and figure out what selection list this is because it's linked directly on that selection list. But if we didn't know, we would first have to make a selection and then click on the title of the program, of the product or the pricing form, and look for that selection in the value section of the modifier of the variable grid. So I would scroll down until I saw this material, which then points out what the variable is, roll stock material. Now, if we look at the product and we look at the variables and we locate the variable roll stock material, it is going to identify what selection list it's using or what dependency of a selection list it's using. In this case, the value of roll stock material is a dependent list name, is a dependent list from the variable roll stock material type, which is right here underneath it, and the dependent list name is roll material. So if we look at roll stock material type, where that dependency is coming from, it displays here what the selection list is, and clicking on this pencil will open up the actual selection list. So looking at this is exactly what's in the drop down on wide format prints, banner, mesh, vinyl, etc. And as we saw on the product, the roll stock material uses a dependent list name called roll material right here. It specifies it, and when you link to a variable that has a dependent list, it's going to show up in the dependent list name drop down. And if you look at the list, you can see that these are just text fields, and this is the material that is in that list. Banner types, banner digital, print vinyl types, paper types, etc. Rob takes to naming the dynamic list as types, which makes sense. It's just a way to separate it from the parent list. And if you look at, for example, banner uses a roll material list of banner types. If we look at banner types, the list itself, it's nothing but a selection list dynamic link to the part category banner digital. So in this list, whenever banner is selected, it jumps over and looks at this list, which is the second item on the pricing form, or the second material selector on the pricing form, and banner types just goes and looks at the part categories. So under banner digital, any part that is included under this category will be included in the pricing form as long as it is active and filtered for direct print.
Okay.
This isn't really important, but to avoid confusion, there are two dependent lists on this. Okay, and Rob has kind of redone this a little bit, so it's not a big deal, but this really serves as a fairly decent example of a couple of the very cool things that you can do with selection list. This material list, Rob had this set up in use with composition signs, and I think he's changed something here, but he kept the second dependency. Now, these dependencies are hard-coded in terms of the function of it. is hard-coded into selection list and the program. So if I say insert column, one of the categories here is add a dependent list link, which is what these things are. And there's also another one, another item in this drop-down that's very cool to use, which is add property.
Yeah, I used a lot of both of those.
Okay, well, all right. So you have an idea of how that works, and property really just depends on how you want to use it, because it's really just a value field, either true or false, or it could be really any number of things. It could be a variable, it could be a formula, it could be true or false. In this case, Rob has one called hide mounting. Now, it used to be that the hiding of the mounting option on pricing forms was hard-coded into the pricing form. So, technically speaking, mounting only showed up when vinyl material was selected. And that was a problem, because customers would use mounting with other substrates or media, and technically, even though this was a minor thing that I normally changed for people, you do have to set them to customizable to make the change. Well, seeing that being a problem, Rob added that property onto the selection list, where there's now a hide mounting property, which you can either set to true or default it, and a default is always going to be a 0 if there's no value there. So default means no or 0, to where hide mounting is true if banner is selected or mesh banner. And so on the pricing form, now the customer themselves can determine when they want to hide the mounting functions or not. Now, on the pricing form itself, you can see what Rob had to do by clicking on any of the mounting options on this pricing form, and you'll see that all of them have a visibility formula. And knowing that that's the case, if you go and read that formula, you can see exactly how you can test to make sure that that condition is true in any capacity that you need it. In this case, Rob is just using this, checking to see if it's true, as to whether or not to hide it on pricing form, but it can be used in any way imaginable. So any time that it's very cool. All right, it's about 5 till. I'll be quiet and check and see if anyone has any questions.
Actually, I did have a question.
Okay.
Go ahead. Just on the Rush modifier, I noticed that we don't have textile on there, on the product list for that.
That's because textile doesn't have modifiers in the traditional sense. If you look at the textile product, there are no modifiers on it, but...
Yeah, there are.
Is there?
It's on the More button. Go over to the description, More, and then hit the variable grid V at the top, and then options.
Wow. That's crazy.
I mean, it's buried, but it's there.
You gotta... I don't know... That was on here under More.
Yeah.
Variable grid. Yeah.
Okay. I'd have to check a couple of things out, and one is, before using this, okay, so quantity 0, description, textiles, are these... I don't know that these are... there's 2 components to this pricing form. This part, the quote type, and the t-shirts. So
I think it's for
overall.
the whole thing. If you go to a type at the bottom, quote type,
Yeah.
and go to that, just pick any one of them. And then go to the More button down there. You can affect it through the child.
Yep, I see that. Okay.
So the one on the right on the main form is for the
Yeah, I
upper
understand.
part, the parent, the T-shirts, and then that second one at the bottom for each of the types is for that. But I know it's kind of buried, but I noticed that we didn't have it on that list. Should we have it there because it is now in the product?
I mean, there's no harm in that, Linda. There's no harm at all in doing that. I don't know why we wouldn't. But the point is, really, by the time customers get to set up textiles and think about rush charges, they're really going to be doing them a little bit different than we are. More than
So you
likely.
can't really catch all the possible scenarios for that. Is another way of saying it.
No, almost
It's
nobody
just
has a blanket rush charge. It's either broken down into scenarios. So it's very rare that somebody uses rush and not.
But I guess the point for our discussion is the flexibility of the software to handle really an unlimited amount of possibilities within the product or processes
to
add modifiers.
That's right. And the other thing is, if you're going to add them to the quote type, you would do it up in this point. You know, I don't know that. Gosh, I didn't really even know about that until just now.
Wow, I stumped the master. Wow.
Geez, I mean, you'd stump Indiana Jones with that level of burial.
It's not fair because I work in OOB. That's how come I knew that. But
Yeah, that's what that does. Sure.
yeah, I know Lori had brought that up a while ago that she wanted the ability of it in textile, but we weren't quite sure where to put it, and that's where we decided.
Yep. No, that's cool. I just didn't know. I guess it's the same way on.
It's the same way on composition, I believe.
Yeah.
Anything that has this child tab container.
Yep, and it does just apply to the top level.
Yeah.
I don't know how
Okay.
critical it would be to add it to textiles, but it wouldn't hurt at all.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Anything else?
Yeah. What other kind of properties would you add? Just generally, I know the
Well,
mounting and all that, but what other ones would be common that you'd come across that you'd see just to have an example?
I'll give you an example of one that comes in fairly common, and if you set it up for your customers, a lot of them will be grateful. People who do a lot of retail goods in using the miscellaneous pricing form, you have a scenario where that pricing form is just pulling objects or something from a selection list to pull in the product and the price. So in a new list, you could do something like add a new property and call it description. All right, and tell the customer that in this description field they can type in an unlimited description. So if they're doing business cards B and W, and they want to
And Peter, I don't want to
I know,
interrupt
we
you,
need
but
to
we
go.
do have a call coming up.
they want to, if they, in the absence of having a description field, they're going to have to, for retail goods, they'll have to type in a description for every item in their drop-down box. Now, you could insert a description field and tell them they can type in any description they want here, okay, and save that as part of the selection list. then when they go to create their retail goods product that's going to have that option in the drop-down list, in this variable here, which is the description variable, you can set it to list property text of that selection list. Subcontract item name is the variable that this list is, and the property text for the description. And so based on what they select here, their description will always update here, and they don't have to type it manually. That's just one possibility, but it could be a whole lot. And if you look at Rob's resolution selection list under flat stocks, you can see where he really maxed it out with various formulas under properties that he then pulls into other formulas. It's really quite cool. All right, that's it, Linda.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll meet again this time tomorrow.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Peter, I'll see you over on the other meeting ID.
Yep. We'll be there in a moment.
Bye.
Bye-bye.